Oh yeah, ethnic map. Red is Russian, hashed red is Ukrainian, and you can see very clearly that it's a complete mess down in the Caucasus. If the Russians lose the ability to project military power to the Caucasus, they will lose control of it. At a minimum, we will have a third Chechen war, and that will be the beginning of the end of the Russian system. All right, one final general monologue here. Let's talk about what's going on with the economy and tech and banking and with the Fed. Okay, the whole idea of the tech sector is you're imagining things that don't yet exist. And to do that, you need two things. Number one, you need a not so small army of wired together 20 and 30 somethings who are young, intelligent, creative, skilled, and collaborative to imagine the future, to develop the prototype, to figure out how to operationalize it, and then to go into mass manufacturing, to design that system. None of those steps generate any income. So the second thing you need is a near bottomless supply of very, very cheap capital. We're no longer in that environment anymore. The oldest the oldest millennials turn 44 this year. There will never be any fresh millennials in their early 20s again. We have passed the peak of what they can contribute to this sector. And capital costs have already gone up by a factor of 5 in the United States. They probably have a ways to go. More on that in a minute. But we're never going back to the capital and labor environment that we've enjoyed these last 15 years. So tech was always going to take a bit of a breather. There's also the question of whether or not we can carry anything forward. For products that have not been operationalized yet, we now have a capital and labor shortage. We're going to have to focus on a few very specific things that have already been brought to that level of operationalization. Now, it's possible that artificial intelligence is one of those things. The release of ChatGPT last fall is a really promising sign that that has already made it over the hurdle. But just the software, that's not enough. ChatGPT, AI in general, requires massive volumes of computing power. And we're probably not going to have the amount of chips that we need to build the server farms that we need to do this at scale. Now, there's 3 types of chips in the world. At the low end, you've got the ones that come out of China that are 90 nanometer and bigger. These chips are near analog. They can only do 1 or 2 things. This is what's in your smart light bulb. This is what's in the Internet of Things. There's about $1,000 of these low-end chips in a Tesla just to handle the basic left-right stuff. We're probably going to lose all of that. Now, we can rebuild that capacity elsewhere, but the Chinese are 80% of global supply. The other 20% comes out of Japan and the United States, and we don't have to reinvent anything here. We just have to build the fab facilities, but just means a minimum of 2 years. 4 is probably more realistic. So that low-end stuff, that's going to take a big breather. Then you've got your high-end stuff, 10 nanometers and smaller. This is gaming consoles. This is iPhones specifically. This is a lot of high-end servers. And above all else, it's AI. AI chips are the most advanced ones we make. They're 4 nanometer and smaller. And 90% of those come out of Taiwan. Now, a lot of folks suggest that this is a reason why the Chinese would invade Taiwan. I don't see it that way. A couple things to remember about the Chinese. Anything below 10 or above 10 nanometer, they have no chance of. In fact, you really have to go down to about 40 nanometers before they can play at all. But 40 to 90 nanometers, kind of the mid-range dumb chips, they do produce at scale, but they do so with imported equipment, imported software, and imported labor. Now, I'm sure there is a diversity of opinions on this call about Joe Biden. I know I have at best mixed feelings myself, but one of the things the Biden administration did last last fall, is he told all Americans who were working in the Chinese chip sector, and most of the foreigners are Americans, that they now had to choose between their citizenship and their job. And within 24 hours, every American employed in the sector was either transferred abroad or quit. The Chinese tech rise is already over. They can't make the hardware that they need on the mid-level to do anything that they need, much less the high level. So if the Chinese were to conquer Taiwan tomorrow without firing a shot, it wouldn't matter at all because they wouldn't know how to operate the facilities. In fact, most of the designs come from the United States or Japan. So, those wouldn't flow anyway. But even if they did, the Chinese wouldn't know how to operate these things because they can't operate most of their own without foreign help. Now, there's also an issue about what happens to the chip environment anyway. The 10 nanometer and smaller chips are made in Taiwan, yes, but they're not designed there, and the equipment doesn't come from there. There's a constellation of 9,000 companies around the world that allow us to make those high-end chips. Very few of them are in East Asia at all. But if anything happens to globalization, we lose part of that constellation. And of those 9,000 companies, roughly half of them only produce one product for one customer, and there is no global equivalent to the product that they make. If we lose them, we lose the capacity to make that piece of the puzzle. I'm not so much worried about Taiwan. I'm worried about places like Germany, which is where all the lenses for the lithography come from. You can even imagine a scenario where California gets a little wonko with its policies and we lose the ability to make the lasers that make the lithography possible. It doesn't take a lot of countries falling out of that coalition for the entire thing to break down. In fact, one or two would be plenty. And rebuilding that would be difficult because that constellation, that hyper specialization at every point of the process has literally required decades of global peace, cheap capital, and ample labor on a global scale. That's not our environment anymore. We can do it. We do it in less than 10 years. So we're going to lose the low-end chips because China's going away. And we're going to lose the high-end chips because we're losing globalization. Now, it's not all bad news. Those low end, that high end, that is only 20% of all chips by value. The middle 80%, everything from automotive to aerospace to most people's phones to power management things at utilities, all of that stuff, that's in the middle. And there's more than one player. In addition to the Chinese, you've got the Americans, the Italians, the Germans, the Koreans, Taiwan again, and Japan. There's a redundant system for building this. There is no single point of failure. So if China falls off the map and globalization breaks, we will still have most of the chips that we need. What we will lose is the ability to digitize the low end. And what we will lose is the ability to push the frontier at a rapid pace. All things considered, with everything else going on in the world, that's a scenario I'm actually pretty positive on because it means we don't lose anything we have. The digitization we've done the last 15 years, most of that holds. There are exceptions, of course. I'd hate to be Tim Cook right now because he's going to lose his entire chip system. Okay, in this environment, globalization breaking down, demographic aging, changing the market rules, I am thrilled that we've only lost 4 banks. Moreover, the 4 banks that we've lost were non-standard. All of them were tech banks, and tech banks work differently. Throughout the rest of the system, people raise capital either by taking out loans or issuing stock. That's not how it works in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is primarily driven by venture capital, and you get your cash mostly in lump sums. So what the people who run the startups do is they take that lump sum, they park it in a bank, and then they just draw upon it as they need it for payroll and costs and resources and everything else. What happened with the 4 banks that went under is the depositors got spooked and they yanked their capital. Well, the banks had just basically put all of that capital into things like government debt, and they couldn't liquidate fast enough. And then when they did liquidate, they had no assets. So it was a very, very non-standard bank run. Normally what happens is you get loans that go bad for a bank, and then the bank runs out of operating capital and people pull their money out and you get a collapse. That hasn't happened anywhere.